The wind whistled through the cracks in the door like a mournful song, and Jonah Riker could feel the chill seeping into my bone. Wyoming, summer 1879. But tonight the sky was shifting as if to signal the coming storm. It had been 3 years since Belle had left, and the house was still shrouded in mourning. The smell of hay and leather lingered. But above all, there was a dull, lingering pain. Then a knock sounded on the door, firm but also hesitant, piercing my eardrums like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. "Sir, I was told you needed a cook." That voice, though trying to remain calm, still contained the trembling of fatigue and a faint glimmer of hope. I opened the door slightly, my tall figure silhouetted under the lantern light, my tired eyes deeply marked by the traces of time. "I have lived alone since Belle. My wife died of fever 3 summers ago. Since then, the farm has remained in operation, but my heart has not." My eyes flickered to Clarabelle, the woman standing there with a heavy cast-iron pot in one hand and a worn cookbook in the other. She was thin, weathered, but with determined eyes. Then, a tiny shadow, hidden behind her skirt, slowly emerged. A little girl with curly black hair and large, alert eyes was peeking at me. "Daisy," Clarabelle whispered, her voice softer as her tiny hand gripped her mother's sleeve. A strange, sudden feeling tore through the icy walls in my chest. It had been a long time since I had allowed any new faces into this house. Yet, this child's eyes did not beg for mercy. It longs for a place to belong. I took a deep breath, my voice hoarse as unhewn wood. "I think I need a family." Clarabelle froze, and Daisy blinked in surprise, still clutching the pot handle. She didn't say a word. I stepped back, as if avoiding a cliff, then opened the door wide, silently inviting them in. Clarabelle set the pot gently down on the porch. Daisy stood motionless, her thin face illuminated by the fading light of the afternoon. Clarabelle nodded, her voice soft and full of relief. "Thank you." I cleared my throat, stepped back into the cabin, and motioned for them to enter. Clarabelle took Daisy's hand and carefully stepped through the doorway, one hand holding the pot and the other holding the cookbook. The door closed softly behind them, bringing a breath of fresh air into the house that smelled of dust, leather saddles, and the faint scent of Belle's rose-stained shawl, long kept. Only a single oil lamp burned dimly at the end of the corridor. The walls of the house were bare, except for a few saddles and a neatly hung rifle. Belle's portrait still looked down from above the fireplace, her dark eyes filled with the warmth I had been deprived of since her death. "I know this is sudden." Clarabelle cleared her throat. "I understand if you have nothing for me. We come from faraway Kansas. I can cook, and Daisy, she won't be any trouble." I looked at her, then at the little girl, golden hair and shy figure. I remembered my daughter's laughter. Now gone, I looked at the swaying lamp, then at Clarabelle's worn shoes and her frail composure. I gestured to the chair by the fire. Clarabelle carefully placed the pot on the floor and led Daisy to sit down. The girl sat there, legs dangling, staring into the fire until her reflection dissolved into the light. Clarabelle set the pot near the table. I cleared my throat. "What do you know about cooking for farm workers?" My voice was gruff. I didn't want to show my concern. Clarabelle straightened and replied calmly. "I cooked for travelers and mushers on the Santa Fe Trail. I learned recipes from my mother and grandmother. Campfire stews, biscuits, jam. I know how to feed men who ride hard and sleep outdoors." I looked at her, then at the pot, then at Daisy's hands clasped together in her lap in prayer. I nodded. Clarabelle exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Riker." I hesitated. "No titles here." My voice came out lonely. She bowed her head slightly. "Jonah," I muttered in acknowledgement. Clarabelle set the pot down, arranging it near the fireplace so the scent could spread. Daisy leaned forward, staring at my worn boots. I cleared my throat again and said, "Make yourself comfortable. There's water in the basin, blankets on the rack." Without hesitation, Clarabelle helped Daisy take off her coat and placed it gently on the back of a chair. The child's expression relaxed a little. I turned away and looked toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms above. I said nothing more. Clarabelle bent down and lit the small oil lamp on the table. Daisy sat by the fire, her face flushed and her eyes heavy with the fatigue of the journey. Clarabelle took off her gloves and slowly, gently stroked her hair. I stood in the doorway, looking on, motionless as I had done so many times before. But this time I didn't feel empty. I felt a glimmer of light. Clarabelle looked up, our eyes meeting for a moment. "We won't bother you," she promised. I nodded once. "We'll see." I closed the door without turning on the main light. Outside, The wind whispered through the log. Inside, 3 hearts beat softly in the dim light, and Jonah Riker wondered if he had opened more than one door tonight. That night, the wind howled against the wooden walls of Riker Ranch, but inside, something warmer stirred. Clarabelle moved about the small kitchen with her sleeves rolled up and her steps purposeful. She was making her mother's southern meat pie. Layers of slow-braised beef, carrots and onions are encased in a golden, crispy crust. The scent of thyme, garlic, and brown butter began to fill the air, weaving through the rafters and softening the hard edges of the house. Jonah Riker sat at the table, his elbows on the worn surface, his eyes following her hands as they worked. He said nothing. He didn't ask what she was cooking, didn't offer to help. He just watched silently, unable to read her. Clarabelle pulled a heavy cake from the oven, setting it down with a thud that broke the silence. She divided it into 3 pieces, each slice steaming in the cold evening air. Daisy climbed into a chair, arms crossed as if she were at a Sunday dinner. Her eyes were shining. Clarabelle placed a plate in front of Jonah. "Nothing fancy," she said, "but it will fill you up." Jonah didn't answer. He took a bite, chewed, then another, then another. Clarabelle waited, hoping for something. A nod, a word, anything. But Jonah kept eating silently until his plate was empty. He stood up, took the plate to the sink, and washed it himself. Clarabelle blinked. She had expected resistance, even a command. Not this. Quiet, almost respectful. She joined him at the sink with her plate, their hands brushing once over the soap. Neither said anything. Across the room, Daisy yawned, then reached for a rag. "Mommy said I could help clean." "Tum," she said, dragging the rag across the floor. Clarabelle smiled, just in the corner. "Honey?" Daisy nodded, moving around the table like a fluttering feather. But the long day and the warm food soon tired her out. Within minutes, she had sunk into the cushioned chair by the fire, the rag still in her hands, her head tilted to one side, her eyes closed. Jonah turned and saw the girl. He froze. That chair, his wife's old rocking chair, had not been used since she died. It still bears the shape of grief, memories of nights of waiting, of hoping, of praying. Yet here, a child, small and trusting, curled up where silence had once reigned. Jonah walked down the hallway. From a drawer he hadn't opened in 3 years, he pulled out a wool blanket, his wife's, with a blue and rust pattern. He hesitated for a long moment, his fingers trembling on the edge of the blanket. Then he turned, walked softly to the fireplace, and knelt down beside Daisy. He gently placed the blanket over her shoulders. Clarabelle stood at the sink, taking it all in. She held her breath. She didn't expect kindness. Not like that. Not from a man with so many walls around him. Jonah stood up and didn't look at her. Instead, he went to the door, opened it a crack, and looked out into the cold. The wind blew in strongly. He didn't blink. Clarabelle whispered, "Thank you." He said nothing, but his hand remained on the door frame longer than necessary, as if he were holding up something stronger than the weather. That night, the smell of grilled meat lingered in the air long after the plates were cleared. The fire crackled softly, and under a blanket that had once belonged to sadness, a child dreamed fearlessly. And in a house where grief had spoken loudest for 3 long years, something softer, something wordless, finally responded. The sun hung high in the New Mexico sky, casting long streaks of light across the backyard of the ranch house. The dry wind carried dust across the hard ground, but Jonah Riker didn't seem to notice. He was in the stables, running long strokes down the back of an old mare with a silvery brown coat and a cloudy eye. Clarabelle stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a towel, watching the silent man and the silent animal. The horse never blinked as Jonah brushed his hair over its shoulders, even as he muttered things low enough that only the wind could hear. Clarabelle had seen this tenderness before, once in her father's hands. When he thought no one was looking, she filled the glass pitcher with lemon juice, cut from the only lemons she had brought from town, and added a few crushed mint leaves. She stepped out into the heat, barefoot across the yard. Jonah looked up as she approached but said nothing. He continued to brush slowly and steadily. Clarabelle offered her some water. "It's hot," she said. Jonah glanced at the jar, then at her, then nodded. He put down his brush, picked up his glass, and took a long drink. "Is she yours?" Clarabelle asked, tilting her chin toward the horse. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "Belle? I had her before the war." Clarabelle blinked. "That's a pretty name." He looked into her eyes for just a sec. "That's my wife's name." She understood why he treated the horse as if it were a memory in shape. She seems gentle. She lost an eye in a hailstorm, he said. Some horses panic when they lose their sight. She just adapts. Clarabelle nodded slowly. The strong ones always do. They stood in silence for a long moment, the wind blowing through the hedges. Jonah turned to face her, glass still in his hand. You're from Georgia. Clarabelle looked surprised. The accent and the way you cook, he said with an almost imperceptible smile. She allowed herself a small laugh. Born in Montauk, left when I was 16. Too many ghosts. Jonah's eyes darkened. I know how it feels. Clarabelle shifted and spoke softly. My father died in Antietam, and so did my brothers. Not long after, my mother also passed away before the war ended. Jonah looked down at the horse and stroked its neck. My wife died here. The fever took her very quickly. 2 winters ago, Clarabelle's voice was barely audible. And Belle, she stopped eating after that, Jonah said. I think she missed her. Clarabelle reached out and stroked the horse's mane, letting silence fall over them for a moment. She reminds me of someone. Clarabelle said. Jonah looked up. Your husband. She shook her head. There was no wedding, just a mistaken trust. He disappeared before Daisy could say her first word. Jonah studied her face, not with judgment, but with something else, a tenderness, perhaps a new understanding. I thought about giving her his last name. Clarabelle added, but he doesn't deserve it. Jonah nodded slowly. Names mean something. The heat was overwhelming, but Clarabelle felt the heaviness in her chest ease a little. Maybe it was the shade. Maybe it's the fact that someone is finally listening. Jonah drained the last of his lemonade and handed her the empty glass. Thanks. She took it. Nothing. He reached for the brush again, and as he brushed Belle's fur, he said, Daisy likes to talk. You don't? I used to be like that. She said, then life gave me more to carry than to talk about. He paused, looking at her. You're taking it well. Clarabelle looked into his eyes. You too? Neither of them smiled, but as she turned home, Jonah looked after her, not out of suspicion or politeness, but because for the first time in years, silence no longer felt so necessary. The wind changed direction in the late afternoon, becoming sharp and urgent as a storm approached. The clouds piled up like bruises on the horizon, and the golden color of the steppe faded to gray. Inside the cabin, Clarabelle looked up at the ceiling, where a steady, rhythmic drip was falling into a tin bucket. She put down her sewing and stepped outside. Looking up at the roof, a board had come loose near the chimney. From the ground, she could see the black streak where the wind and water had begun to invade. Jonah was moving feet into the stables as she walked around the house with a hammer in one hand and a bundle of shingles under the other arm. You shouldn't be on the roof, he said before she could say anything. Clarabelle did not stop. You should not let rain get into your kitchen. He stood there, arms crossed, watching her walk toward the ready-made ladder. The last storm ripped 2 boards off. I was going to fix it. When? She asked, already starting to climb. Before or after the next storm blows the whole roof off. He muttered something under his breath and followed. The wind picked up as she reached the top. From there, the view stretched for miles of rolling meadows, hedgerows, and in the distance, the outline of an old road. But Clarabelle didn't look away. She focused on her work, kneeling near the loose board, her fingers steady as she nailed it back into place. Jonah's boots clattered behind her. He joined her with a grunt, handing her a new nail as she reached for one. Do you do this often? He asked. She smiled half-heartedly. Cooking feeds the stomach, but carpentry keeps a roof over the head. He chuckled, his first real laugh since she arrived. Together, they worked in rhythm. She held the board. He hammered the nails. She smoothed the edges. He filled in the gap, bit by bit. The old roof came together again. Just as she turned to adjust a bundle of boards, her foot caught on the edge of a dusty, slippery beam, and she slipped and fell. Her arms flailed wildly. The sky spun, but before she could fall, a hand grabbed her wrist. Strong, quick, holding her like a rope thrown from the sky, Jonah lunged forward. His free hand pressed against the wood, his chest heaving with the sudden movement. Clarabelle held her breath, her fingers tightening on his arm. Their faces were inches apart. I have you, he said, his voice low and husky. She didn't answer, couldn't. They stood like that, breathing mingled, hearts pounding, eyes locked on something older than words. His hand didn't let go. When's dinner ready? Daisy's voice rang out from below like a sudden bell. The spell was broken. Clarabelle took a sharp breath. Jonah helped her up. his hand still holding hers long enough for them both to feel the emptiness of its departure. They finished the last shingle in silence, though no one could hear the wind anymore. When they climbed down, the sky was beginning to glow with the eerie lavender of an approaching storm. Clarabelle brushed her hands off and glanced at him. "Thank you," she said softly. Jonah nodded, his jaw clenched. "I mean it. I've got you." She didn't answer. She just went inside, her heart pounding with something that wasn't fear, but fragility all the same. The next morning, the storm was calm in the way only prairie mornings can be, still pale, almost solemn. Clarabelle rose early and began tidying the living room while Daisy slept, curled up under the covers by the fireplace. She was dusting a bookshelf when her hand touched the edge of a lower drawer, a drawer she had never seen open. The knob was stiff, unused. It stuck, then opened with a soft groan. Inside was a bundle of old letters, tied neatly with faded ribbon. Clarabelle hesitated. She glanced over her shoulder, saw no one, then carefully untied the ribbon, as if the paper might crumble with her breath. The handwriting was small, beautiful, and unmistakably feminine. She read the first few lines, her heart tightening with each word. "Jonah, my love, I know the fever will win this time. There is so much I want to say, so much to put into a letter. But if you find it after I'm gone, please, please remember, don't let your pain become the house you live in. Grieve for me, but don't bury yourself with me." The signature at the bottom is tiny, Belle. Clarabelle's fingers trembled. The weight of the words weighed like the hands around her chest. She carefully folded the letter, tied the ribbon, and placed it back where she found it. She said nothing. That afternoon, the air carried the first breath of winter. A cold wind whispered through the corners of the cabin, and a fire burned steadily in the fireplace. Clarabelle stirred the pot of beans and cornbread, her thoughts still swirling around those delicate lines. Daisy sat at the table coloring. Jonah came home late from tending the livestock. He smelled of leather and pine smoke, his usual silence filling the room. But tonight felt different. After dinner, Clarabelle began clearing the plates. Jonah stood up too, then surprised her by gently taking them from her hand. "Let me do it," he said. She nodded, uncertain. When she returned after putting Daisy to bed, the kitchen was clean. The room was dim, lit only by a weak fire. Jonah sat in his usual chair beside him. The other chair, the one opposite him, always empty, always sacred, had been pulled forward a little. He looked up as she entered. Then he patted the cushion beside him. Clarabelle stopped. He said nothing, just waited slowly, as if unsure whether she was intruding on something sacred. She crossed the room and sat down. The fire crackled. Jonah's voice was almost a whisper. "She always sits there, even when she is too weak to speak. She likes to listen to the wind." Clarabelle looked into the fire, then at him. She was kind. "I can tell by the way this house remembers her." He nodded. "She left me a letter." "I know," Clarabelle said softly. Jonah did not respond. He turned his head only toward the window where the stars twinkled faintly through the frost. She said, "Don't let your pain become the house you live in." Clarabelle leaned forward. "Do you think it already is?" "I think it's still trying." She looked down at her hands in her lap. And now, Jonah turned to her, his eyes darker in the firelight. "Now maybe I need to let someone else help build the next house." The fire crackled between them. Clarabelle felt herself holding her breath, not because he said he loved her, but because he gave her a chair, a space beside him, a beginning. That morning, the wind carried an eerie silence, too still, too alert. Clarabelle noticed it first, the way even the birds seemed to hold their breaths. Jonah was at the stables mending a fence, while Daisy played with her rag doll on the porch steps. That was when the man arrived. He rode alone but confidently, better dressed than most of the passers-by, in a brown coat with polished boots and gloves, too clean for honest work. His horse snorted and pawed the ground as if it sensed the unease before the human did. Clarabelle stepped out. Instinct told her to. She reached behind the door frame for the small kitchen knife she always kept nearby. The man slowly dismounted, smiling like a salesman, but with eyes appraising every corner of the farm. "Good morning, ma'am." He tipped his hat. "I believe we have a common interest, Daisy." "Is it?" Clarabelle's voice remained calm behind her politeness. "Who are you?" He tucked his gloves into his belt and pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. "My name is Warren Keyes. I am a relative of the late Samuel Langdon, my cousin, and by law, that makes me the next of kin of his daughter. I came to get custody of my child." Clarabelle felt her knees go weak. Daisy timidly hid behind her, clutching Clarabelle's skirt. "That bastard is not her cousin." Clarabelle said, her voice shaking with anger. And Samuel never gave you the right to speak for him. He's dead, and so are any rights you thought you had. Warren smiled slowly. Calculatingly, I thought you might say that, which is why I brought the file. He waved the folded paper. Affidavits. Official seal from Santa Fe. All legal. And when the sheriff comes next week, you'll be in compliance. Jonah approached silently behind the man, tool still in hand. He stopped at the bottom of the porch step, eyes locked on Warren. You are trespassing, he said simply. Warren turned, taking a step back when he saw Jonah's size. And you must be Mr. Riker. I was told you were a reasonable man. I'm here for a child, not trouble. Jonah's face remained unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for his weapon. He just stepped forward, standing between Warren and the porch. This house isn't yours. This child is not yours, and your blood will never give you the right to call her family. Warren blinked, surprised by the calmness. I have the right. You want to risk hiding a child who by law? Jonah cut him off. There is no law that allows a man to twist a child into ransom. I've seen your kind before. Cleanly dressed, smooth-talking, dirty hand. Clarabelle stepped forward, anger burning behind her calm demeanor. He worked with the quartermaster at Fort Lincoln. My daughter's father trusted him, and he used that trust to smuggle records and maps out west. You were fired for bribery. Now you think because I was there, because I saw what you did, you can use my son to shut me up. Warren's mask cracked a little, but then he smiled again. You have quite the imagination. But let's see how bold you are when a federal warrant comes to your door. I will be back, and next time I will have a search warrant. He mounted his horse without waiting for an answer and rode off, the dust of his threat trailing behind him like a storm cloud. For a long moment, neither Jonah nor Clarabelle said anything. Daisy clung to her mother's leg, her eyes wide. Jonah finally turned back. We'll get ahead of it, he said. We'll find the sheriff first. Bring the truth before he does. Clarabelle nodded slowly, her eyes still on the road. She didn't tremble. She won't, because this house is no longer just a shelter. It's a line, and Jonah Riker just drew it with his posture and word. The train whistle echoed faintly from the canyon below. As Jonah Riker adjusted his coat against the chill wind, the town was an hour's ride from the farm, but his purpose made the journey feel shorter than it should have been. He tied Bell to a pole outside a brick building with a sign that read Elliott and Sons Legal Services. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old dust. The man behind the desk looked up, his bespectacled eyes narrowing as he saw the tall figure in the doorway. What can I do for you? I need to speak to Joseph Elliott. They say he handles land disputes along the old railway line and civil defense issues. 2. The man narrowed his eyes, then nodded toward the back room. You're lucky. That old dog still bites. Jonah entered. Joseph Elliott was thin with a long gray beard, and his hands shook just a little as he set down his teacup. But his voice was steady. Do you have any complaints or problems? Both, Jonah said. Taking off his hat, it's about a woman and her dog. Someone's threatening to kidnap her with forged papers. He set a sheaf of papers on the table. Old letter, notes, legal correspondence Clarabelle had kept for years. Proof of her name, her story, and her place beside Daisy. Joseph studied them in silence. Then, with a sigh, he sat up straighter. I remember the Langdon scandal. Quartermaster, smuggling manifests west. The feds tried to bury it, but so many wagons disappeared that people couldn't help but notice. Jonah nodded once. He got caught in it. Then she ran away. Been on the run ever since. Joseph poured himself another cup and added, do you believe her story? More than my life. The old lawyer looked at him, his eyes sharp. Then he pushed back his chair and opened a locked drawer. There's a provision that was put in place after the war. Compassionate guardianship is used to protect orphans and widows when the bureaucracy is slow or cruel. I can file papers, make you legal guardian on a permanent basis, and make it clear that Clarabelle's record has no arrestable crimes. Just unproven accusations. He scribbled on a form, then looked up. You know, Mr. Riker, the West is only wild when the good guys are quiet. He paused, tapping his pen. You just yelled back. Jonah left town that afternoon with a leather folder tucked into his saddlebag. Back at the farmhouse, the sun was starting to set. Clarabelle was packing. She moved silently through the kitchen, folding Daisy's clothes into a duffel bag, her face unreadable. Jonah stepped through the door, casting a shadow on the floor. You don't have to go, he said. I have to go, Clarabelle whispered. That guy'll be back. I can't let Daisy grow up afraid because of me. Jonah reached into his coat and pulled out the file. She hesitated, took it, opened it. Inside were sealed documents, official, legal. Her name listed next to Daisy's, his as guardian. Clarabelle stared at the papers as if they were something sacred. No one is taking you away from here, Jonah said softly. Not with this one. Clarabelle said nothing. Not at first. Then her shoulders shook. One breath, two breaths, and the tears fell without warning. Not out of fear, not out of panic, but because for the first time in years, she felt seen, trusted, protected by the law, not just by love. She clutched the papers to her chest and looked at Jonah through blurry eyes. You did all this. He just nodded. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest. You made no promises, she whispered, but I trust you more than anyone ever did. They stood there for a long time, between a packed bag and an unopened truth, and outside, the wind no longer felt cold. A month later, the hills of Riker Ranch no longer echo with just the sound of the wind. Laughter danced on the breeze, mixed with the clucking of chickens and the clatter of pots and pans from the open kitchen window. Clarabelle stirred a pot of soup while Daisy read aloud from the porch, her small voice echoing across the dirt yard. Jonah was fixing the chicken coop, muttering under his breath. It's not a song that anyone would recognize, just a rhythm that means peace. Then the sound of hooves, dust, voices. Jonah stood, wiping his hands, just as a black carriage approached, flanked by two men on horseback. One of them was the man from a few weeks ago, the so-called cousin, with a smug smile. Behind him were two deputy sheriffs from the town. Clarabelle stepped outside, her heart pounding. But before the men could speak, another figure appeared, Joseph Elliott. Behind him, nearly 24 townspeople, mothers with baskets, farmers with mud-stained hats, even a pair of teachers with ink-stained fingers. We came to clear a few things up, Joseph said. Stepping forward, the sheriff dismounted, clearly uncomfortable. Mr. Elliott, we've been told there's a custody issue. No problem, Joseph interrupted. Holding up a sealed file, Clarabelle Langdon and Jonah Riker are Daisy Langdon's legal guardians. The papers have been filed and witnessed, and this man, he gestured to the stranger, is under investigation for falsifying documents and harassing a registered household. The man stammered. You have no proof. We do. A woman stepped forward. The baker's wife, Clarabelle cooks for half this town, never asked for anything more than a place to share what she had. And Daisy taught our children how to read, added the old blacksmith. She's 5 years old and has done more for this place than most grown men. The sheriff turned to the stranger. Sir, I suggest you leave before this town charges you with endangerment and fraud. The man blushed, cursed, and rode away. No badge, no declaration, no place to threaten. Clarabelle let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Daisy slipped her hand into Jonah's. That evening, as the sun set low and the lanterns were lit one by one, something remarkable happened. The townspeople returned, not with tridents or torches, but with gifts. Loaves of bread, wildflowers tied with string, a blanket from the baker's widow, even a new saddle for Belle. They hung lanterns one by one along the fence, each glowing softly in the dust. When asked why, the blacksmith's wife only smiled. Every house deserves light. This house, it has 3. Jonah, standing on the porch steps, felt something shift deep inside. Not sadness, not guilt, but belonging. Clarabelle stood beside him, holding Daisy tightly. They weren't married, not by church or contract, but the way Jonah put his hand on Clarabelle's back and the way she leaned in, it told the whole story. No vows required. That night, after the food was eaten and the music had quieted, Daisy curled up on the porch swing with a notebook on her lap. She wrote, "They say a house needs wood and nails, but I think all it needs is 3 people who won't give up on each other." The moon was high, and from that little porch on the hill, the world felt right, not perfect, but warm. A place with 3 chairs, 3 bowls, 3 voices sharing laughter in the dark. And somewhere between the light of the lanterns and the silence of the stars, Riker's house had become a home.